Picture this. It's the late 17th century, and there's this single, sprawling city just marching its way across the landscape of peninsular India.
Yeah, and we aren't talking about a city built of stone or brick.
Right. It's built entirely of canvas and timber. And the sources say it was 30 miles in circumference. 30 miles.
It's just a staggering footprint.
It really is. I mean, it contained 250 bustling bazaars, 500,000 people, 50,000 camels, and get this, 30,000 war elephants.
Which is a logistical reality that is almost impossible to wrap your head around today.
Exactly. And it consumed literally everything in its path. It stripped the continent bare of surplus grain and just left famine and plague in its wake. But, at the absolute dead center of this moving juggernaut, orchestrating a military campaign that would last 26 years, was just one man.
Yes. A man who controlled roughly 25% of the entire global economy.
Right. But he chose to sleep on a simple mattress on the floor, and he actually stitched his own prayer caps to pay for his personal expenses.
Which is an image that it just perfectly encapsulates the absolute bewildering paradox of our subject today. We're looking at Aurangzeb, the 7th emperor of the Mughal dynasty.
And what a reign it was. I mean, we are taking a deep dive into a rule that stretched for 49 years. From 1658 all the way to 1707.
And within those 5 decades, you see the Mughal Empire stretched to its absolute physical, economic, and administrative zenith.
And this is the crazy part, where the very mechanisms he used to achieve that unprecedented peak are the exact same mechanisms that fractured the empire and guaranteed its collapse.
Precisely. It's a fascinating structural failure.
And that contradiction, that's really the engine of our analysis today. We are pulling entirely from the historical chronicles, the court records, and the synthesized texts of modern historians to piece together the mechanics of this reign.
Because Aurangzeb is, without a doubt, one of the most fiercely debated figures in global history.
Oh, absolutely. The modern political noise surrounding his legacy is just deafening. But our mandate for this deep dive is to strip away the present entirely. We are looking strictly at the primary and secondary sources provided, just to understand the cold, hard architecture of his power.
Which requires us to act strictly as analysts of the text. We have to examine how a ruler navigates this incredibly narrow, perilous space between immense orthodox religious conviction and the brutal, unforgiving, realpolitik required to govern a fractured, diverse population of an estimated 158 million people.
Yeah, 158 million people. And to understand how you end up ruling that many people, we really have to look at the crucible that forged him.
Because the Mughal system didn't just hand you the keys to the kingdom because you were the oldest son.
Right. There was no tradition of primogeniture. It was a system that actively demanded you prove your absolute superiority. And usually that meant through violence.
It was essentially a Darwinian survival of the fittest.
Exactly. And the text gives us this incredible defining moment in 1633. Aurangzeb is just 15 years old. The imperial encampment is set up, and this massive war elephant named Sudakar enters a state of must.
Which basically means the animal is going completely rogue, maddened by a massive surge in hormones.
Yeah, it breaks formation and just stampedes directly through the camp.
And the sources describe a scene of absolute paralyzing chaos. I mean, a modern war elephant is basically the 17th century equivalent of a rogue, heavily armored tank.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
The kinetic energy of an animal that size, unrestrained and aggressive, it means it's destroying tents, crushing palanquins, and scattering the most elite soldiers in the empire.
Right. The instinct for everyone, even the seasoned veterans, is just immediate retreat. Get out of the way.
Of course. It's self-preservation.
But the text notes that 15-year-old Aurangzeb doesn't retreat. He actually spurs his horse directly at the stampeding wall of muscle and tusks, and he hurls his spear at the elephant's head.
Which is just terrifying physics.
Oh, it's brutal. The elephant violently strikes Aurangzeb's horse. He's unhorsed, he's thrown into the dust, and he is mere inches from being trampled into the ground before the animal is finally distracted and subdued.
And the fallout from this event is equally revealing.
Yeah, because the adults in the room, his father, Emperor Shah Jahan, and all the senior nobles, they rush in. And naturally, they chide him for what they see as catastrophic recklessness.
Right, because he is a royal prince. Risking his life in a brawl with an animal is seen as this foolish gamble of vital state assets.
But his response, which is actually recorded in the court chronicles, it's a masterpiece of spontaneous political theater. He
Huh.
brushes himself off and says, let me get the quote, "If the fight had ended fatally for me, it would not have been a matter of shame. Death drops the curtain even on emperors. It is no dishonor. The shame lay in what my brothers did."
What's fascinating here is that that quote is essentially the foundational text of his public persona.
It's like a high-stakes PR stunt.
Exactly. The historical accounts point out that Aurangzeb is already, at age 15, weaponizing his own physical courage to draw this stark, unbridgeable contrast between himself and his brothers.
Especially his eldest brother, Dara Shikoh, right?
Yes, Dara was standing at a safe distance during the chaos.
And reading between the lines of the sources, it's clear this isn't just normal sibling rivalry. Dara Shikoh was the favored son. He was the golden child.
He was positioned as the heir apparent, and he was deeply influenced by the eclectic, philosophically liberal traditions of their great-grandfather Akbar.
Yeah, Dara was an intellectual. He spent his time translating the Upanishads. Meanwhile, Aurangzeb is standing in the dust, publicly branding him a coward.
He's establishing a narrative. He's saying, while my brother philosophizes in safety, I am the one willing to actually bleed for the empire.
And in the context of Turco-Mongol inheritance traditions, that narrative is literal currency.
Because, as the texts emphasize, all sons are considered to have an equal claim to the sovereignty.
Right. They were given governorships, massive military commands, and they basically spent their adult lives building independent power bases.
It's a feature, not a bug, of their political system.
Yeah, it's designed to ensure that only the most militarily capable, politically cunning, and charismatic prince ascends. It's this brutal, multi-decade stress test of leadership.
And that stress test goes completely critical in 1657.
Yes. The sources indicate Emperor Shah Jahan, the man who commanded the wealth of India to build the Taj Mahal, falls desperately ill. And the specific ailment recorded is strangury.
Which we should probably clarify because it's a critical medical catalyst for the entire empire's destabilization.
Please do, because it sounds awful.
It is. Strangury is a severely painful condition characterized by slow, restricted, and agonizing urination. It's often caused by kidney stones or severe prostate issues.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and in a pre-antibiotic, pre-surgical era, this isn't just painful, it causes systemic toxic shock.
So Shah Jahan is completely bedridden. He's sequestered in Delhi. And the only person managing his access to the outside world is Dara Shikoh.
Right, so you have an information vacuum.
Exactly. So from the perspective of Aurangzeb down in the Deccan, or his brother Shuja in Bengal, or Murad in Gujarat, the information blackout from the capital basically reads as coup.
The rumors documented in the text suggest they believe Shah Jahan was already dead.
Yeah, they thought Dara was just propping up the corpse while he consolidated the imperial armies.
And that vacuum is what triggers the War of Succession. And the texts reveal a really fascinating dynamic here about how these factions formed.
Right, because it wasn't strictly ideological, was it?
Not at all. It wasn't a clean split where Orthodox Muslims backed Aurangzeb and liberal syncretists backed Dara.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the historian Satish Chandra points out that loyalties were fundamentally transactional. Nobles and generals aligned based on raw military power, calculated self-interest, and just the sheer charisma of the pretender.
Which perfectly explains the outcome of the Battle of Samigar in May 1658. I mean, Dara has the numerical advantage. He has the wealth of the capital.
But his army is this disparate, hastily assembled coalition.
Exactly. Whereas Aurangzeb brings an army forged in the unforgiving furnace of the Deccan campaigns. They are battle-hardened, unified, tactically disciplined, and Dara is just completely routed.
But conquering the army is one thing. Resolving the political crisis is another.
Right, because Shah Jahan actually recovers from his illness.
He does, and this presents just an unprecedented constitutional crisis for the Mughal state.
I mean, what do you even do? You have a victorious prince who has just conquered the capital, but the reigning emperor is suddenly healthy and demanding his throne back.
And Aurangzeb's solution, according to the texts, is just chilling in his pragmatism.
He doesn't negotiate at all. He declares his father administratively and physically incompetent to rule, and he literally imprisons him inside the Agra fort for the remainder of his life.
He allows him to look out over the river at the Taj Mahal, but he strips him of all executive power.
It's so ruthless. But he goes even further with Dara. He hunts Dara down, captures him, and parades him through the streets in rags.
And then he has him beheaded.
Yeah, on charges of apostasy, deviating from Orthodox Islam. And the sources state he placed Dara's head in a box and had it delivered to his imprisoned father.
Which is extreme.
Hmm.
But the execution of Dara, and specifically that charge of apostasy, is a masterstroke of political justification wrapped in religious doctrine.
How so?
Well, Aurangzeb had to eliminate Dara not just as a person, but as a concept. If Dara lives, he remains a permanent rallying point for any disgruntled noble in the empire.
Oh, I see.
So by executing him for apostasy, Aurangzeb is telegraphing to the conservative ulema, the religious scholars, that this was not a cynical power grab. It was a necessary purification of the state.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that justification hits a massive roadblock almost immediately.
It does.
Aurangzeb goes to crown himself, and he takes the imperial title Alamgir, which translates to Conqueror of the World.
Yeah.
But the sources note that the chief Qazi, the highest Islamic judicial authority in the empire, flatly refuses to legitimize the coronation.
And the Qazi's refusal is rooted strictly in Islamic jurisprudence. You simply cannot legally crown a new caliph or emperor while the legitimate reigning monarch is still alive and hasn't abdicated.
Because Shah Jahan is just sitting right there in Agra Fort.
Exactly. So to the chief Qazi, Aurangzeb is an illegal usurper.
So he's holding the throne, but he lacks the legal and moral mandate, and he has popular revulsion brewing against him. I mean, locking up your father and boxing up your brother's head is extreme, even by 17th century standards.
Especially since Dara and our other brother Murad were actually known for being generous patrons. They had a lot of public sympathy.
So Aurangzeb realizes he's sitting on this powder keg of illegitimacy.
Which necessitates a massive systemic pivot.
Yeah.
The texts argue that this legitimacy crisis is the exact reason Aurangzeb had to aggressively present himself as the ultimate defender of the Sharia.
He needed the theologians, the jurists, and the Orthodox nobility to validate his rule.
Yes, he had to prove that his usurpation was a divine necessity to save the empire from moral decay.
But here's the thing. Once you claim the title Conqueror of the World and Defender of the Faith, you have to actually deliver tangible, overwhelming success.
You can't just talk about being a great emperor.
Right. You have to engineer an empire that outproduces and outconquers everything else on the planet. And looking at the economic data from the sources, the scale of what he built is difficult to fully comprehend.
We're talking about a state that achieved peak territorial expansion and just unparalleled centralized administrative control.
Yeah. The economic metrics from his reign signal this period of intense proto-industrialization.
Under Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire became the largest economy and the most prolific manufacturing power in the world.
And let's define that term for a moment, because proto-industrialization isn't just about, making a lot of stuff.
It's highly structured.
Based on the economic histories, it means the empire wasn't just relying on subsistence farming. They had developed these massive regional specializations.
Right, like Bengal producing enormous volumes of silk and cotton textiles.
And Gujarat dominating maritime trade and shipbuilding.
Right.
They were mass-producing cash crops and manufactured goods for a global export market.
Drawing in massive amounts of silver from Europe and the Americas, long before the advent of steam power.
And the sheer volume of wealth pooling in the imperial treasury reflects this. His exchequer was bringing in an annual revenue of 450 million rupees.
Which is an abstract number until you look at the comparative anchor the text provides.
Yeah, give us a comparison.
This was more than 10 times the annual revenue of his contemporary, King Louis XIV of France.
The Sun King.
Exactly. The monarch who built the sprawling, opulent palace of Versailles was operating on a fraction of the budget that Aurangzeb commanded.
But here is where the economic texts present this really fascinating puzzle. The sources state that early in his reign, Aurangzeb he completely abolished over 80 long-standing taxes, tolls, and cesses.
Which just seems completely backwards, right?
Yeah. If you are funding an empire that is constantly expanding, maintaining these massive standing armies, and you just eliminated 80 streams of revenue, the math shouldn't work. How did he balance the ledger of a hyper-militarized state while simultaneously slashing taxes?
The answer lies in a total overhaul of the agricultural revenue apparatus. And it requires us to look back at his time as a prince when he served as the viceroy of the Deccan. The Deccan region was chronically impoverished and yielded very little tax revenue. Recognizing that you can't squeeze water from a stone, Aurangzeb brought in a highly capable administrator named Murshid Kulik Khan.
To implement what the texts called the Zabit system.
Yes.
And from the descriptions in the text, the Zabit system wasn't just a tax bracket adjustment. It was a massive, granular data collection engine, and they were operating without a single computer.
It was entirely analog. They deployed ranks of Pawaras, village accountants, and Kunungos to physically measure the arable land.
They even standardized the measuring rope so they wouldn't shrink in the humidity,
Yeah,
right?
standardizing the unit of measurement, the gas. They assessed the exact quality of the soil and cross-referenced it with localized crop yields and market prices spanning a decade.
It's just wild. It was an attempt to create a perfectly rationalized, predictable revenue stream.
So they removed arbitrary nuisance taxes that stifled local trade, those 80 remitted taxes you
Oh,
mentioned.
I see.
And they replaced them with a deeply calculated agricultural tax based on actual measured production capacity.
But the most vital mechanism of the Zabit system, according to the sources, was the Takavi loans.
Right.
The imperial treasury actually functioned as a massive agricultural bank. They distributed cash loans to the peasantry to purchase higher quality seeds, better livestock, and to dig new irrigation wells.
It is a systemic investment in the means of production. By extending credit to the agrarian base, they expanded the total acreage under cultivation and increased the yield per acre.
So the overall tax base grew so substantially that the state could easily absorb the loss of those 80 abolished nuisance taxes.
While still driving revenues to that unprecedented 450 million rupee mark.
And he needed every single rupee of that because he was obsessively committed to the territorial expansion mandated by his title.
The empire swelled to encompass roughly 4 million square kilometers.
Pushing deep into the southern peninsula, conquering almost the entire Indian subcontinent.
But these were not easy victories by any stretch.
No. The campaigns in the Deccan were grueling, attritional wars against highly fortified sultanates and deeply entrenched Maratha insurgencies.
The texts specifically highlight the sieges of Bijapur and Golconda. They stand as testaments to the staggering difficulty of this expansion and to Aurangzeb's relentless, almost terrifying persistence.
Let's talk about the siege of Bijapur in 1686, because it's a perfect example of this. The sources show Aurangzeb initially delegating this to his son, Prince Azam Shah, with a force of 50,000 men.
But Bijapur is heavily fortified.
Yeah, and the defenders have a devastating artillery advantage. So the Mughal army gets bogged down, the supply lines are stretched, morale is collapsing, and it turns into this brutal stalemate.
So what does the emperor do? And keep in mind, he is nearly 70 years old at this point.
Right, an age where most monarchs are safely insulated in their palaces.
Exactly. But he doesn't recall the army. He personally marches to the siege lines.
And the chronicles record that his mere physical presence, his assumption of direct tactical command, fundamentally altered the psychology of the Mughal forces.
The texts state that within 8 days of his arrival, this massive stalemate was broken, the fortress was breached, and the Adil Shahi dynasty was extinguished.
Just 8 days. And then the very next year, in 1687, he pivots to the Sultanate of Golconda. And Golconda makes Bijapur look like a warm-up.
Oh, absolutely. The fortress of Golconda is perched on this massive granite hill, surrounded by huge curtain walls.
The sources say the Mughal army was pinned down there for 8 miserable months.
They suffered from famine. Heavy rains washed out their siege batteries.
And their most experienced commander, Kilich Khan, was actually killed by an artillery shell.
It was an utter logistical nightmare.
But again, the texts emphasize Aurangzeb's refusal to accept the physics of defeat. When traditional artillery bombardment and mining failed, the Mughal forces resorted to extreme tactical innovation.
And the detail here is just incredible.
It is. The sources detail how his infantry, operating in total darkness to avoid the defenders' artillery, managed to erect massive, complex wooden scaffolding against walls that were considered mathematically impossible to scale.
The sheer mechanics of doing that in the dark, coordinating thousands of men, suppressing the noise of construction, utilizing the blind spots in the fortress's defensive geometry, it's a testament to a highly disciplined, deeply motivated engineering corps.
Yeah, they scaled the walls, breached a gate from the inside, and forced the surrender of the Qutb Shahi dynasty. But conquering the fortresses of Bijapur and Golconda opened up an entirely new, infinitely more complex problem.
Right. How do you integrate, govern, and physically secure a landmass of 4 million square kilometers against highly mobile, decentralized insurgencies?
Exactly, which forces Aurangzeb into a paradigm shift that defines the entire second half of his reign. To hold the south, he couldn't govern from Delhi or Agra. So he packed up the entire apparatus of the imperial state and he went on the march.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this brings us to the era of relentless military endurance and that phenomenon of the moving capital you mentioned at the start.
For the last 26 years of his life, from 1681 until his death in 1707, Aurangzeb never returned to the northern capitals.
He devoted himself entirely to the Deccan campaigns. The imperial camp literally became the de facto capital of the largest economy on Earth.
And we have to really visualize the logistics of this because it defies modern comprehension. Like we said, it was 30 miles in circumference.
It wasn't just a military bivouac. It housed the imperial court, the treasury, the chancellery, the harems, and all the attendant bureaucracy.
The demographics recorded in the sources are staggering. A population of 500,000 camp followers, merchants, artisans, scribes, families alongside the core military units.
And sustaining this population required that armada of beasts of burden, 50,000 camels and 30,000 elephants.
If we look at this through the lens of modern military supply chains, it's like trying to sustain a massive aircraft carrier strike group, but dragging it across a terrestrial landscape.
The foraging radius required to feed 30,000 elephants and 50,000 camels every single day. It's massive. An elephant can consume hundreds of pounds of vegetation daily.
Which leads to the catastrophic environmental and economic consequences detailed in the texts.
Yeah. If you march a city of 500,000 people and their livestock back and forth across peninsular India year after year, decade after decade, you completely overwhelm the local carrying capacity.
The moving capital basically operated like a swarm of locusts. It systematically stripped the Deccan of its surplus grain, its fodder, and its wealth.
And the sources are unequivocal about the fallout. The disruption of centuries-old agricultural cycles and the total consumption of regional food reserves led directly to severe famines.
And where famine weakens a population, disease follows.
Right. The texts note that the bubonic plague swept through the region, further decimating the populace.
So the very logistical machine Aurangzeb built to conquer the Deccan was actively destroying the ecological and economic foundation.
Disease-ridden, constantly moving canvas city, Aurangzeb maintained an internal discipline that bordered on the fanatical.
Yeah, the chronicles provide highly specific details about his daily routines. They were clearly designed to project an aura of absolute martial invulnerability.
The detail that stands out most fiercely in the texts is his daily inspection of the cavalry contingents.
Because it wasn't just a parade ground review of uniforms. He demanded tangible proof of lethality.
Right.
The sources record that he would have dead sheep carcasses, bound up tightly without their entrails, brought before him, and the young nobles and cavalrymen were required to step forward and use their cutlasses to cleave the bound carcass cleanly in two with a single massive blow right in front of the emperor.
We have to analyze the mechanism of terror and discipline at play here. This isn't just a ruler being eccentric.
No, it's intense micromanagement, like a modern CEO, but with swords and carcasses.
Exactly. He is testing the blade geometry of the weapons, yes, but more importantly, he is testing the wrist strength, the physical biomechanics, and the psychological readiness of his elite troops.
He is inextricably linking a noble's status and career advancement directly to their capacity to inflict catastrophic physical violence.
It's an unrelenting performance of state power. He's operating like a human algorithm, processing data, testing tensile strength, rejecting weakness.
But a single human algorithm, even one as tireless as Aurangzeb, cannot individually adjudicate the disputes of 158 million subjects.
No, the sheer volume of legal friction in an empire that size requires a standardized operating system.
Which brings us to one of the most enduring, yet heavily debated intellectual achievements of his reign, the monumental legal codification known as the Fatwa-i Alamgir I.
Right. The sources indicate that early in his reign, Aurangzeb realized that Islamic legal rulings across his empire were completely scattered.
Yeah, a judge in Bengal might rely on a completely different set of precedents than a judge in Gujarat.
It was a decentralized, ad hoc system that made standardized imperial governance basically impossible. So he commissioned this massive undertaking, employing over 500 scholars and jurists.
And the objective was to synthesize, index, and codify the vast, often contradictory corpus of Hanafi jurisprudence into a single, unified legal code.
And remember, this is in an era before digital databases or searchable archives. These scholars had to manually cross-reference centuries of theological and legal texts to create a standardized manual for imperial judges.
It covered everything, right, from criminal law and property rights to taxation and marital disputes.
Exactly.
But analyzing the text, we have to ask a question. What was the primary driver here? Was the Fatawa Alamgir I purely an expression of Aurangzeb's deep religious piety, his desire to see his subjects live under a perfect orthodox Islamic framework? Or was this a calculated, highly sophisticated tool for state centralization?
Because if you dictate the exact legal parameters of everyday life, you centralize your control over the population, even if you're sitting in a tent 1,000 miles away in the Deccan.
Right, so which was it?
The modern historical analysis presented in our sources suggests it was a profound intersection of both, but with a critical caveat. The text highlights a permanent underlying tension in his governance between Sharia, the religious law codified in the Fatawa, and Zawabit, which were the secular, pragmatic decrees issued by the state.
Meaning that when the religious law conflicted with the practical necessity of running the empire, the emperor's secular decree won out.
Precisely. Aurangzeb was undeniably pious, but he was fundamentally an emperor. If a specific stricture in the Fatawa Alamgiri impeded the collection of revenue or the suppression of a rebellion, he would issue a zawabit to override it in practice.
He created this massive religious legal framework to standardize the empire, but he fiercely guarded his own sovereign prerogative to operate outside of it when statecraft demanded it.
And his intellectual pursuits extended well beyond jurisprudence. The sources detail his deep patronage of Persian scholarship. He was intellectually formidable.
Fluent not just in Arabic and Persian, but in Chagatai Turkic.
Which is a vital detail to note. Chagatai Turkic was the ancestral language of the Mughal dynasty. It was the linguistic thread that connected them back to their Central Asian lineage, to Timur and Genghis Khan.
So maintaining fluency in it was a statement of dynastic continuity.
Yes, but Persian was the lingua franca of the administration, the language of the chancellery, and the courts.
He also possessed an intense personal obsession with Islamic calligraphy, specifically the Naskh style, which is known for its clarity and legibility.
The texts note that under his reign, the demand for finely transcribed Quran manuscripts peaked.
And this wasn't just him commissioning artists. Aurangzeb was a master calligrapher himself. The chronicles describe him sitting in his tent amidst the dust and noise of the moving capital, meticulously copying the Quran by hand.
It's a striking juxtaposition. The man who commands the most terrifying military machine on earth finds his center of gravity in the quiet, exacting discipline of tracing Arabic script.
Yeah. But here's where it gets really interesting, because this image of the deeply orthodox, scholarly Muslim emperor brings us to the absolute epicenter of the historical debate surrounding him.
Because while he was copying the Quran and codifying Hanafi law, the vast, overwhelming majority of his 158 million subjects were Hindu.
And how he managed that non-Muslim majority is where the texts present a deeply fractured, deeply complex narrative.
And as we established, we are navigating this strictly through the primary and secondary sources, analyzing the mechanics of his policies without projecting modern political agendas onto them.
Right. Because the sources themselves offer a staggering duality. On one hand, the texts document a series of policies that signify a sharp turn towards strict Orthodox Islamic governance.
For example, in 1663, the sources record that he issued an imperial decree banning the practice of sati, the Hindu custom of widow burning.
Then, in 1679, we see the reimposition of the jizya.
And the jizya was a traditional Islamic tax levied on non-Muslim subjects, theoretically in exchange for their protection and exemption from mandatory military service.
It had actually been abolished a century earlier by Akbar, who prioritized a deeply syncretic, integrated state model.
So the reintroduction of the jizya was a seismic shift in Mughal policy. And the texts note it was met with intense criticism, not just from Hindu rulers, but from senior Mughal court officials and even members of Aurangzeb's own family.
However, the sources also demand we look at the specific mechanics of how it was implemented. It wasn't just a blanket, indiscriminate extortion.
Right. The text specified that the jizya was heavily tiered based on socioeconomic status.
The wealthy paid a higher rate, while the poorest tiers often had the tax waived entirely, especially during famines or poor harvests, which, given the devastation of his Deccan campaigns, was frequent.
Furthermore, the decree explicitly exempted women, children, the elderly, the disabled, the unemployed, and crucially any non-Muslim who served in the state bureaucracy or the military.
And that last exemption is the key to understanding the pragmatism buried inside the orthodoxy.
Exactly. If you were a Rajput commander or a Maratha administrator working for the Mughal state, you did not pay the jizya.
It functioned as a financial mechanism that simultaneously appeased the conservative ulema who demanded orthodox taxation, while actively incentivizing non-Muslims to join the imperial apparatus.
But the pragmatism of the tax code is fiercely overshadowed in the historical record by the physical destruction of religious sites.
The chronicles clearly document that Aurangzeb ordered the demolition of several highly prominent Hindu temples. The texts specifically name the Vishwanath Temple in Varanasi and the Kesavadeo Temple in Mathura,
He also ordered the execution of highly significant non-Muslim and heterodox figures.
including the ninth Sikh guru, Teg Bahadur, who was beheaded in Delhi, and the Sufi mystic Sarmad Kashani.
And we must define why a Sarmad Kashani was targeted. He was an antinomian Sufi, meaning he actively rejected established moral laws and orthodox religious structures, believing that spiritual truth transcended organized religion.
The texts say he walked the streets naked and openly mocked the orthodox ulema.
Right. To Aurangzeb's vision of a highly regulated, legally codified state, an antinomian figure with a massive public following wasn't just a heretic. He was a vector for social anarchy.
Now, how historians interpret these executions and temple destructions is where the texts diverge fascinatingly. Older colonial historians and many nationalist historians that followed read the primary sources literally through a lens of pure, unadulterated religious bigotry.
They framed these acts as the ultimate proof of Aurangzeb as a one-dimensional, zealot oppressor who simply sought to eradicate Hinduism.
But the modern historians cited in our texts, scholars like Richard Eaton, argue that reading these events solely as religious persecution fundamentally misunderstands the political geography of 17th century India.
In the Mughal operating system, major religious institutions were not just places of worship. They were massive economic centers and deeply potent symbols of political sovereignty.
Meaning that a temple's survival was often directly tied to the political loyalty of its patrons. The texts point out that the Kesavadeo temple in Mathura wasn't destroyed out of random malice. It was targeted following a massive, bloody uprising by the local Jat peasantry in that specific region.
The temple was seen as the ideological and financial nexus of the rebellion.
Similarly, the modern analysis of the Vishwanath Temple in Varanasi links its destruction to the political maneuverings of local rajas who had actively aided the Maratha leader Shivaji Aurangzeb's most intractable enemy in escaping from Mughal custody.
To Aurangzeb, destroying the temple was an act of punitive statecraft. It was the physical dismantling of the rebels' symbolic authority.
The texts note he also ordered the destruction of schools in Varanasi where Brahmins were teaching what he termed false books,
which were attracting both Hindu and Muslim students. He viewed this syncretism as subversive to the state's orthodox foundation.
So it's statecraft executed via demolition. But if we accept that these destructions were politically motivated rather than purely ideological, it suddenly explains the massive glaring contradiction that appears elsewhere in the imperial records.
Because if you turn the page in the sources, you find the exact same emperor, the man who tore down the temple in Mathura, thus being firmans, imperial edicts, granting state funds and land grants for the maintenance and protection of other Hindu temples.
Yes, the historical records contain numerous firmans documenting his direct financial patronage. The texts explicitly list grants given to the Mahakaleshwar Temple in Ujjain, the Umananda Temple in Guwahati, various Balaji temples in the south, Jain monastic orders, and several Sikh gurudwaras.
It's a duality that gives you intellectual whiplash.
I mean, how do you reconcile the destroyer of the Vishwanath Temple with the patron of the Mahakaleshwar Temple?
You reconcile it by viewing Aurangzeb as the ultimate cold-blooded pragmatist, managing an incredibly fragile web of alliances. The metric for his favor was not religion. It was absolute loyalty to the Mughal state. If a temple complex, its priests, and its regional patrons were loyal, they were integrated into the imperial patronage network and aggressively protected.
But if they were suspected of harboring rebels or funding sedition, they were annihilated.
Precisely. And this ruthless pragmatism dictated his hiring practices as well.
And this is the statistic in the sources that I find most staggering because it completely subverts the popular narrative. During the second half of his reign, from 1679 to 1707, the exact period when he is prosecuting the Deccan Wars, imposing the jizya, and supposedly acting as a puritanical zealot, the percentage of Hindu officials serving in the upper echelons of the imperial administration actually rose by half,
reaching 31.6%.
Which, as the texts verify, is the highest percentage of Hindu inclusion in the imperial administration in the entire history of the Mughal dynasty. He employed a higher ratio of Hindus in his government than his great-grandfather Akbar, who is historically celebrated as the paragon of Mughal tolerance.
And the sources are clear on the mechanics of why this happened. It wasn't born of a sudden burst of modern inclusivity.
It was a military necessity. To fight the grinding wars in the Deccan, Aurangzeb desperately needed the localized tactical expertise of Maratha commanders.
He needed their cavalry, their knowledge of the terrain, and their administrative networks.
So he aggressively recruited them, offering them massive salaries and high imperial ranks, completely bypassing any religious litmus test.
The sources provide a direct quote from Aurangzeb that perfectly encapsulates his philosophy on human resources. A group of Sunni nobles presented a petition to the emperor, requesting that he fire Persian officials from the bureaucracy simply because the Persians were Shia Muslims, and the Mughal state was officially Sunni.
They were trying to leverage his known orthodoxy to eliminate their political rivals.
Exactly. But Aurangzeb sees right through it, and he flat out rejects the petition. His written response is incredible.
Oh, I have the quote right here. He writes, "What connection have earthly affairs with religion? And what right have administrative works to meddle with bigotry? For you is your religion, and for me is mine. If this rule were established, it would be my duty to extirpate all the Hindu rajas and their followers. Wise men disapprove of the removal from office of able officers."
Wise men disapprove of the removal from office of able officers. It is the distilled essence of realpolitik.
Yeah, he viewed religion as a deeply personal mandate for his own soul, and occasionally as a blunt instrument of statecraft when dealing with rebellions.
But when it came to the daily administrative machinery of generating that 450 million rupees, he refused to let bigotry interfere with competence. He compartmentalized his piety and his statecraft with terrifying efficiency.
And that extreme compartmentalization is perfectly mirrored in his personal lifestyle. The man who commands the vast wealth of India, whose state apparatus can fund temples and armies simultaneously, lives a life that is almost aggressively austere.
We mentioned earlier that he controlled 25% of the world's wealth. He is the direct descendant of Shah Jahan, the man who built the Taj Mahal, the Peacock Throne, the absolute zenith of conspicuous imperial consumption.
The Mughals were globally renowned for their opulence, their heavily bejeweled garments, their lavish court miniature paintings.
Yet the texts describe Aurangzeb living a life that actively repudiates all of that. He had memorized the entire Quran. He stringently observed every ritual, fast, and prayer.
It's like a billionaire choosing to live in a studio apartment and eating ramen. It's a total departure.
And because of this profound, orthodox austerity, he systematically dismantled the cultural apparatus of the court. He greatly reduced imperial patronage of musicians.
He withdrew funding for the figurative Mughal miniature paintings, viewing the depiction of human and animal forms as frivolous, bordering dangerously on idolatry.
He essentially stripped the Mughal court of its traditional sensory extravagance. He wore simple, unadorned clothing.
The text suggests this was partly a psychological reaction to the perceived excesses of his father and brothers, right? A need to visually represent himself as the austere, incorruptible guardian of the state.
Though the texts do note he didn't abandon imperial patronage entirely, he just redirected it.
Yeah, he still sponsored massive architectural projects, but they were marked by a distinct Islamization of the Mughal aesthetic. The focus shifted away from romantic, syncretic monuments like the Taj Mahal and toward grand, unambiguous expressions of Orthodox faith.
We see this beautifully illustrated in the sources with two specific mosques. First, the Moti Masjid, or the Pearl Mosque, which he commissioned inside the Red Fort in Delhi.
It was built for his own personal use. It is carved from pure white marble, exquisitely detailed, but it is small, enclosed, and intensely focused on private, austere prayer.
It is architecture designed for a man who seeks isolation with God, not a public stage.
But when he did build for the public stage, the scale was staggering. He ordered the construction of the Badshahi Mosque in Lahore in 1671.
The sources confirm that for centuries, it remained the largest mosque in the world, and it is still one of the largest in the Indian subcontinent today.
Its massive red sandstone walls and sweeping courtyard were designed to accommodate tens of thousands of worshippers. It is a sheer, unapologetic projection of Orthodox imperial dominance.
So we have the full paradoxical picture constructed from the texts. A man who memorizes the Quran, lives like an ascetic, and writes edicts protecting competent Hindu administrators while simultaneously operating a relentless military machine that destroys rebel temples, annexes millions of square kilometers, and generates a quarter of the global GDP.
So what does this all mean? We have to ask, what is the final trajectory of this system?
The sources point to an ending that is defined by profound structural exhaustion.
The final years of Aurangzeb's reign represent the closing of an era, and the data paints a remarkably bleak picture. The empire had expanded to its absolute physical limits, but that expansion had hollowed out its core.
We return to those 26 years of endless warfare in the Deccan. The historian Stanley Wolpert, cited in our texts, analyzes the Deccan campaign and definitively labels it a Pyrrhic victory.
Meaning they technically won, but the cost was so high it was basically a defeat.
Exactly. The Mughals technically won the fortresses, but the cost negated the triumph. Wolpert estimates that in the last decade of the campaign alone, the warfare, combined with resulting famines and plagues, was costing an estimated 100,000 lives a year.
100,000 lives a year. And the financial ledger finally broke. Despite pulling in 450 million rupees annually through the Zabit system, the costs of sustaining the moving capital, constantly bribing Maratha commanders, and endlessly sieging fortresses completely drained the treasury.
The empire, at its absolute peak of territorial size, was driven to the brink of total bankruptcy.
The historian Jos Gummins provides perhaps the most incisive analytical quote in the entire source text regarding this paradox. He writes, "The high point of imperial centralization under Emperor Aurangzeb coincided with the start of the imperial downfall."
It is the ultimate paradox of absolute power.
Yeah.
The exact moment he achieved maximum control, when the borders were widest, the legal code standardized, the revenue highest, was the exact moment the structural integrity of the machine shattered under the sheer weight of its own operational demands.
And the text suggests that in his final days, Aurangzeb possessed the terrifying clarity to see this. He is nearing 90 years old. He has outlived many of his own children and his most capable generals.
He's dying in a military camp in Bingar in 1707. And the sources record a letter he wrote to his son containing a dying confession that is just profoundly haunting.
He writes, "I came alone and I go as a stranger. I do not know who I am nor what I have been doing."
After a lifetime defined by absolute, unyielding certainty, a man who defied a stampeding elephant at 15, imprisoned his father, executed his brother, and imposed his will on 158 million people, he faces death, questioning the fundamental purpose and the ultimate reality of everything he built.
And true to the austerity he practiced in life, the texts note he died with only 300 rupees to his personal name, money he earned from stitching caps and copying the Quran.
He ordered that specific money to be given to charity. He explicitly forbade the construction of a lavish mausoleum.
Today, the man who was once the wealthiest sovereign on the planet lies buried in a simple, unmarked, open-air grave in a courtyard in Kuldabad.
But his final, perhaps most devastating failure of pragmatism was his handling of the succession.
Right. Despite knowing firsthand the catastrophic damage a war of succession causes, he failed to firmly establish a single heir, leaving vague instructions for his 3 remaining sons to divide the empire.
And predictably, the moment he died, his sons ignored those instructions and plunged the empire into a massive fratricidal war.
The victor, the Hadur Shah Arust, inherited an empire that was financially hollowed out, administratively exhausted by decades of over-centralization, and culturally fractured.
The relentless momentum Aurangzeb created could not be sustained by lesser men, heralding the irrevocable collapse of the mighty Mughal state.
It leaves you entirely awestruck by the mechanics of history. I mean, we spent this time tracing the architecture of a reign that pushed the Mughal machine to its absolute maximum capacity. Aurangzeb expanded the geography, maximized the economic output, codified the laws, and relentlessly commanded the armies. Yet, by achieving that uncompromising level of absolute control, he effectively guaranteed the machine would tear itself apart from the inside out.
Which raises an important question, something for you to consider as we close this deep dive. If an entity, whether a 17th century empire, a modern superstate, or even a massive global corporation, achieves maximum territorial reach, peak economic output, and ultimate centralized control, yet collapses precisely because of the weight required to maintain that endurance, is absolute success actually just the first unavoidable stage of failure?
What does Aurangzeb's 26-year fruitless chess game in the Deccan tell us about the devastating illusion of absolute control?
It's a question that resonates far beyond the 17th century.
That is exactly why we analyze these historical texts, to understand the underlying physics of power and how they echo across time. We are going to leave it there for today. Thank you for joining us as we unpacked the complexities of the sources, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.